Several years back, about 5 or so, I was introduced to the webcomic Piled Higher and Deeper via the January 9th, 2004 comic where the character Cecilia defines for another character, Tajel, what a geek is. While I like and somewhat agree with that definition, it isn't absolutely accurate, but I do feel it is a good starting point for a good working definition. The definition the comic gives is intense fanatics of unconventional subject matter who proudly memorize its minutiae and incorporate it into every aspect of their lives. The first hole in this definition for me is the term fanatic, which Merriam-Webster defines as marked by excessive enthusiasm and often intense, uncritical devotion. One major aspect that does not work for me there is the idea of uncritical devotion. As anyone who knows geeks or is a geek will tell you, we're rarely not critical. Often even more so of the things we love. Reactions to George Lucas in the past decade and a half are a very good example. There is also the idea of excessive enthusiasm. While this is true at times in certain circumstances for geeks, it isn't really any more true for them than of anyone else. For this working definition, I'd rather replace fanatics with fans. While the latter term may have originated as a shortening for the former, it has since become a softer term which Merriam-Webster defines as an ardent admirer or enthusiast. The second hole I'd like to address is the idea of unconventional subject matter. Most geeks are just as interested in the minutiae and esoterica of various mainstream popular cultural elements as they are of more obscure content. Finally, there is the part there of incorporating this into every aspect of one's life. While this is accurate, it is an unnecessarily verbose way of saying it's an aspect of one's self-identity. With this, I'd like to shift the working definition to instead be those who are intense fans of the minutiae and or esoterica of some subject matter, and for whom this is part of their self-identity. While for some this may seem overbroad, remember that while perhaps the majority of humanity will fit the first part of the definition, only a small portion of them will fit the self-identity part. Now that we have a working definition of what we mean when we use the word geek, I'd like to address why it even matters to have that definition. I've personally self-identified as a geek for the majority of my life, certainly since the period when I finished elementary school in 1991, and likely earlier, though that period is more a hazy cloud in my memory than anything discrete. I have been interacting online in some way, shape, or form under various names since shortly thereafter. In essentially 2 decades of interacting online, I have seen this topic of what a geek is debated almost constantly, from my first BBS experience to just last week. During the 80s, and so far as I can tell from things others have said on the subject, most of the late 20th century before then, geek, nerd, dork, and dweeb were pejorative terms for those who fell outside the mainstream either because of areas of interest or low social standing, whether by lack of social skills or lack of interest in socializing. During the 90s, as first geeks, then the rest of humanity got connected via the internet, there began a concerted effort to take back these terms and make them our own. Geek was the first of these to successfully move from purely pejorative to meaningful self-identity, largely because of its nature both as the most generic and the least commonly used as pejorative. The other 3 have since followed suit to greater or lesser degree. In the process of trying to shift these terms, however, we ultimately created an all-out subculture centered around the fact that it's okay to be a geek, a nerd, or whatever. But we ultimately had to be introspective about what we're saying it's okay to be, and that's the real crux of such debate. Are we saying it's okay to be misanthropic loners with exclusively academic or trivial interests and no real development of social skills? There is also the fact that those outside our niche subculture still misunderstand us, thinking us childish and petty for engaging in hobbies such as collecting toys, playing games, and otherwise waxing nostalgic about the joys of our youth. To which I'd like to suggest the famous words of C.S. Lewis from On 3 Ways of Writing for Children as rebuttal. Critics who treat adult as a term of approval instead of as a merely descriptive term cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it's grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these things are the mark of childhood and adolescence. And in childhood and adolescence they are, in moderation, healthy symptoms. Young things ought to want to grow up. But to carry on into middle life or even early manhood, this concern about being adult is a mark of really arrested development. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up.